For 2,000 years, skeptics have questioned whether Jesus of Nazareth actually walked the earth as a real person. But archaeological discoveries and ancient texts have provided compelling evidence that demands serious examination from historians worldwide. The first piece of evidence comes from Flavius Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who documented the entire region. In his writings, Josephus specifically mentions Jesus, his brother James, and the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate's authority. Roman historian Tacitus also confirmed Jesus' execution, describing it in his annals while documenting Emperor Nero's reign. Even Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, wrote letters to Emperor Trajan specifically asking how to handle Christians. The Jewish Talmud, though hostile to Christianity, actually confirms Jesus existed and was executed during the Passover festival. Archaeological evidence includes this first-century tomb, matching exactly the Gospel accounts of Jesus' burial and resurrection. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who documented everything about that era. Josephus wrote about Jesus in his Antiquities, describing him as a wise teacher who performed surprising deeds and attracted many followers. He even mentions Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate and the continuation of his followers afterward, matching perfectly with Christian accounts. The evidence becomes even stronger when we examine archaeological findings that confirm details from the gospel narratives about Jesus' life. In Nazareth, archaeologists discovered first-century houses carved into limestone, exactly matching descriptions of Jesus' humble hometown in the Gospels. Even more striking, they've uncovered first-century fishing boats from the Sea of Galilee, exactly like those Jesus' disciples would have used. The physical evidence extends beyond artifacts to locations themselves, with archaeologists identifying sites mentioned repeatedly in the Gospels. The Pool of Bethesda, where Jesus healed a paralyzed man, was found exactly where John's Gospel said it would be. When you combine written records from multiple independent sources with archaeological evidence, the case for Jesus' historical existence becomes overwhelming. The convergence of evidence from hostile sources, neutral observers, and archaeological discoveries creates an overwhelming historical case for Jesus' existence. When historians apply the same evidentiary standards to Jesus that they use for other ancient figures, his historical existence becomes undeniable. Even scholars who reject the religious claims about Jesus acknowledge his historical existence as an undisputed fact of ancient history. The question is no longer whether Jesus existed, but how we interpret the extraordinary impact one person had on history. From a carpenter in Nazareth to a figure who reshaped civilization, the evidence confirms Jesus walked the earth as a man of flesh and blood. Historical records paint a portrait not of myth, but of a controversial teacher who challenged authority and paid the ultimate price. These weren't merely religious texts written by believers, but official Roman records documenting a political execution that threatened imperial authority. The convergence of enemy testimony, neutral documentation, and archaeological evidence creates an unshakable foundation for Jesus' historical existence. Whether viewed through the lens of faith or historical scholarship, one fact remains clear. Jesus of Nazareth was undeniably real. The evidence requires no faith to accept, only an honest examination of historical facts that have convinced scholars from every religious perspective. Archaeological discoveries continue to mount, each finding adding another layer to our understanding of Jesus' historical existence. Recent excavations at Capernaum have revealed the actual house where early Christians gathered, identified through inscriptions and architectural evidence. The Pilate Stone, discovered in Caesarea, provides direct archaeological confirmation of Pontius Pilate's governorship during Jesus' crucifixion. Ossuary boxes from first-century Jerusalem bear the names of individuals mentioned in gospel accounts, confirming the historical accuracy of New Testament figures. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 AD, refers to Christ's execution under Pontius Pilate, providing hostile confirmation of the Gospel accounts. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 90s AD, mentions Jesus twice in his comprehensive history of the Jewish people. Even hostile sources could not deny Jesus existed. They could only attempt to explain away the movement he started. The convergence of archaeological findings, hostile testimony, and neutral historical records creates an irrefutable case for Jesus' historical existence. From Roman executioners to Jewish historians, from archaeological discoveries to hostile accounts, the evidence points consistently to one conclusion. Jesus of Nazareth was a real person who lived in first-century Judea, whose existence is as historically documented as Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. This evidence doesn't exist in isolation, but forms a web of interconnected testimonies spanning cultures and centuries. Roman records corroborate Jewish accounts, which align with archaeological findings, creating multiple points of independent verification. Even hostile sources inadvertently confirmed the basic facts. A Jewish teacher existed, gathered followers, and faced Roman execution. Archaeological evidence stands as a silent yet powerful witness, a frozen, physical testament to a historical and cultural reality. The convergence is undeniable, multiple sources from diverse perspectives, all documenting the same historical figure and events. This was no legend forged over centuries, but contemporary documentation from multiple sources recording events as they unfolded. The historical evidence requires no leap of faith to evaluate. Only the same scholarly standards applied to any figure of antiquity. From Roman crucifixion records to Jewish historical accounts and archaeological discoveries, the evidence converges on one conclusion. The question isn't whether sufficient evidence exists, but whether we are willing to apply consistent historical standards. Jesus of Nazareth walked the streets of first-century Judea, a historical reality documented by friend and foe alike. Beyond a reasonable doubt, the evidence converges. Jesus lived, he taught, and he left an indelible mark on human history. The Roman Empire recorded him. Jewish historians acknowledged him. Archaeological discoveries confirm the historical context of his existence. His followers transformed from frightened fugitives into bold witnesses, willing to die for what they claimed to have seen. The movement he started exploded across the ancient world, reshaping civilizations in ways that demand a historical explanation. Even hostile sources confirm his existence, acknowledging the man they opposed but could never erase from history. The empty tomb became a historical puzzle that critics and defenders alike were forced to explain. Ancient manuscripts, carefully preserved, carry his words and deeds across 20 centuries to reach us today. Archaeological evidence confirms the places, the people, and the practices described in the accounts of his life. Multiple independent sources, examined through standard historical methods, point unmistakably to one conclusion: Jesus was real. The historical Jesus stands firmly established, not on faith alone, but on the foundation of evidence that historians demand. Beyond the manuscripts and archaeological sites, the impact itself becomes evidence of an undeniable historical presence. No movement in history has ever grown from a person who never existed, from pure invention without foundation. The explosive spread of a movement against all odds across the ancient world demands a catalyst. That catalyst was a person, a teacher, an executed criminal whom followers claimed had risen from the dead. Followers who transformed from frightened fugitives into bold proclaimers, willing to face persecution and death. Their testimony, their suffering, their changed lives point back to an encounter they insisted was real. The birth of the Christian movement, documented by hostile and neutral sources alike, demands explanation. The only adequate explanation, examined honestly, is the historical reality of the person at its center. 7 independent lines of evidence converge, each reliable by standard historical methods, all pointing to the same conclusion. A teacher from Nazareth, executed under Pontius Pilate, whose legacy transformed the ancient world and continues today. The convergence of evidence creates an overwhelming case, verified through multiple independent historical methodologies and sources. From Jewish historians documenting their own people to Roman officials recording provincial administration, the testimony accumulates across cultures. Archaeological discoveries continue to confirm details from written accounts, transforming ancient texts into verified historical documentation. Even hostile witnesses unwittingly provide confirmation, their criticisms preserving details about events they wished had never occurred. The rapid spread of the movement itself becomes evidence, impossible to explain without a foundational historical catalyst. Witnesses transformed by specific experiences they claim to have had, willing to face persecution for maintaining their accounts. The documentary evidence proves consistent with archaeological findings, literary analysis, and historical context from multiple independent directions. Professional historians examining sources without theological agendas reach the same fundamental conclusion about basic historical facts. The burden of proof shifts decisively when multiple independent testimonies align on core historical details across hostile boundaries. Standard historical methodology applied consistently demands acceptance of basic historical facts, regardless of one's interpretation of their significance. The historical Jesus emerges not from faith, but from converging testimonies across hostile sources, documenting an undeniable first-century presence. Roman administrative records, Jewish historical accounts, and early Christian documents independently confirm a Galilean teacher executed under Pontius Pilate around 30 CE. The convergence isn't coincidence. It's the inevitable pattern when multiple independent observers document the same disruptive historical reality, preserved despite later theological embellishment. Josephus's brief mentions, Tacitus's hostile confirmation, and Pliny's administrative reports weave an evidentiary web that no serious historian can dismiss as mere fabrication or myth. Even the Talmud's hostile references confirm the essential framework. A teacher from Nazareth who performed acts deemed sorcery, executed during Passover, whose followers claimed resurrection. Archaeological evidence corroborates the textual record. First-century Nazareth existed, Pilate governed Judea, and crucifixion was the standard Roman penalty for sedition during that precise era. Ossuary inscriptions, boat remains, architectural fragments. This physical evidence confirms the gospel settings weren't literary inventions, but accurate reflections of first-century Galilean and Judean reality. No credible historian claims Jesus never existed. The debate centers on the interpretation of actions and claims, not whether a Galilean teacher named Jesus was crucified under Pilate. The mythicist position collapses under scrutiny. It requires dismissing multiple independent sources, misunderstanding first-century textual transmission, and ignoring standard historical methodology applied to any ancient figure. The historical Jesus emerges as clearly as any figure of antiquity, attested by friends, enemies, and neutral observers, a first-century Galilean whose existence is historical bedrock, regardless of theological interpretation. The evidence forms an interlocking network, each source confirming and reinforcing the others across cultural boundaries. Paul writes within 20 years, Josephus within 60, Tacitus within 80, placing them closer to the events than most of ancient history. These timeframes allowed eyewitness testimony to circulate, be challenged, and still survive into the written record. The criterion of embarrassment applies powerfully. Early sources preserve awkward details that no inventor would ever include. The crucifixion, Peter's denial, the disciples' fear and confusion, these unflattering elements argue for the weight of authentic historical memory. No fabricated Messiah story would portray followers as cowards, a leader dying in shame, or women as the primary witnesses. These culturally awkward details survived precisely because they actually happened. Eyewitnesses could not erase the inconvenient truth. The hostile attestation from Josephus and Tacitus provides especially powerful confirmation. Enemies documenting facts they wished were not true. This convergence, multiple independent sources, enemy attestation, embarrassing details, and temporal proximity, creates overwhelming historical evidence for Jesus' existence. The seventh and final piece of evidence comes from an unexpected source, the silence itself. When Jesus' earliest enemies had every reason to deny his existence, they never did. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Jewish leadership, they called him a deceiver, a blasphemer, a troublemaker. But they never said, there was no such person. Their very attacks assumed his existence. When the Talmud refers to Yeshu in hostile terms, it confirms rather than denies. The Romans executed him as a political threat. That hostile record validates rather than undermines. You don't execute a myth, you don't document the death of a legend. The very hostility of ancient sources becomes evidence. They argued with a man, not a myth. This is the evidence, not one source, but a convergence impossible to dismiss as coincidence. 7 pieces of hard evidence. Each one alone would be significant, but together they form an unshakable truth. The archaeological record speaks where texts remain silent, physical evidence carved in stone and sealed in earth. Pilate's name, etched into limestone in Caesarea, confirms the gospel accounts with brutal clarity. James, brother of Jesus, called Christ. Even hostile sources inadvertently confirm the connection. The execution of James by Sanhedrin order, documented by Josephus, remembered by the Church. Tacitus records Christ's execution under Pontius Pilate, history written by Rome's own hand. Pliny the Younger describes Christians worshipping Christ as God, testimony from one seeking to destroy them. Even the Talmud acknowledges Jesus, attempting to explain away his works while confirming his existence. Suetonius mentions the expulsion of Jews from Rome over Chrestus. Conflict proves a real man sparked real divisions. Lucian mocks Christians for worshipping a crucified sage, scorn that confirms the cross, the man, the movement. The very hostility of ancient sources becomes evidence. They argued with a man, not a myth. 7 pieces converge, from Tacitus to Josephus to archaeology, painting an undeniable portrait of a man who walked these streets. No myth would leave fingerprints in Roman archives, Jewish histories, and pagan mockeries alike. Only a real person could. The Romans recorded his execution, the Jews his troubling ministry, his followers his words, independent voices agreeing on his existence. When enemies and allies both confirm the same facts, when conquerors and conquered agree, the debate shifts from if to why. The evidence doesn't just whisper, it shouts across 2 millennia that a Jewish teacher named Jesus lived, taught, and died in 1st century Judea. Stone inscriptions don't lie, government records don't fabricate, enemy testimony doesn't flatter, each piece independent, each piece irrefutable. Critics demand proof and find it in abundance. Layered through archaeology, corroborated by history, confirmed even by enemies. The question isn't whether Jesus existed, the evidence settles that, but what we do with a life that shook empires. History confirms the man. Now each person must reckon with his message, his claims, his unavoidable challenge to every life. 7 pieces of evidence, stone, scroll, and skeptic, all testifying that Jesus of Nazareth walked this earth, lived this life, left this legacy. The convergence of evidence, each source independent, each voice unexpected, creates an undeniable historical portrait of one man's existence. Roman efficiency documented him. Jewish opposition acknowledged him. Pagan historians recorded him, each for their own purposes, yet all confirming his reality. The man who disrupted their world left marks they could not erase, inscriptions in stone, references in hostile texts, memories in bitter ink. No fabricated legend receives such hostile documentation. No invented figure appears in the records of those who wished him forgotten. The evidence speaks precisely because it is reluctant. Adversaries forced to acknowledge, bureaucrats compelled to record, critics unable to deny. From Galilee's shores to Rome's archives, from Jerusalem's courts to Bithynia's correspondence, independent voices creating an unplanned chorus of confirmation. The historian's dream, multiple independent sources, hostile witnesses, archaeological corroboration, all converging on a single historical conclusion. This is not belief appealing to faith. This is history demanding acknowledgement. These are not devotional claims, but documented facts. 7 pieces of evidence, each independent, each verified, collectively forming a historical verdict that transcends skepticism and settles ancient debate. The question is no longer whether Jesus of Nazareth walked this earth. The evidence has rendered that question answered. The question now becomes not whether he existed, but what we do with that knowledge. History has spoken. For those who seek truth, the evidence stands accessible, documented, cross-referenced across cultures and centuries, undeniable. This is the convergence of archaeology, literature, enemy testimony, and neutral record, all pointing to one conclusion. The historical Jesus stands documented by friends, enemies, and indifferent observers, a triple confirmation unmatched in ancient history. From Josephus documenting the execution, to Tacitus recording the movement, to Pliny describing the worship, consistency emerges. The burden of proof has shifted. Skeptics must now explain why this comprehensive evidence should be dismissed. No comparable figure from antiquity enjoys such diverse, hostile, and contemporary documentation. This is historical bedrock. The evidence doesn't demand faith. It demands an honest engagement with a documented reality accessible to anyone. This is not legend crystallizing over centuries. This is contemporary testimony solidifying within decades of actual events. The verdict of history is clear. Jesus of Nazareth walked this earth, taught, was executed, and sparked a movement that changed the world. The convergence of evidence creates an unassailable historical fortress, multiple independent sources pointing to one undeniable conclusion. Roman bureaucratic records, Jewish historical accounts, early Christian testimonies, each independently confirming the same basic facts about one man. These aren't believers trying to prove their faith. These are historians, officials, and even critics documenting what they witnessed or investigated. When antagonistic sources agree on core facts, historians recognize this as the strongest possible historical verification available. The Roman Empire documented his execution. Jewish historians recorded his movement's impact, and followers preserved his teachings, triangulated truth from opposing perspectives. This isn't the circular reasoning of faith. This is the historical method applied with the same rigor used for any ancient figure. We don't question whether Julius Caesar existed, yet the evidence for Jesus meets or exceeds the same historical standards. Multiple contemporaries wrote about him within living memory, closer documentation than we have for most ancient figures historians accept without question. The historical Jesus emerges from the evidence as clearly as any figure from antiquity. He taught, gathered followers, was executed, and sparked a movement. These 7 pieces of evidence don't require faith to acknowledge. They require only an honest engagement with documented historical reality. Yet each piece, from Roman records to eyewitness testimony, forms an unbreakable chain of historical verification. No serious historian disputes the basic historical reality. A Jewish teacher named Jesus lived in first-century Judea. The question isn't whether he existed, it's whether we're willing to examine the evidence honestly. These sources don't demand faith, they demand attention to what ancient testimony actually reveals. From the shores of Galilee to the courts of Rome, the footprints are unmistakable. Independent sources, hostile witnesses, archaeological discoveries, all pointing to the same historical conclusion. This isn't about converting skeptics to believers. It's about acknowledging what the historical record clearly shows. The evidence stands whether one approaches it with faith, skepticism, or simple historical curiosity. What we find is remarkably consistent. A figure who taught, gathered followers, and was executed by Roman authorities. The historical Jesus is as well documented as any ancient figure, and far better documented than most. The evidence emerges from multiple independent sources, each adding layers to the historical portrait. Roman records, Jewish writings, and early Christian accounts converge on the same basic historical framework. They describe a teacher from Nazareth who performed remarkable deeds and gathered devoted followers throughout Galilee. His crucifixion under Pontius Pilate appears in Roman administrative records as documented historical fact. Jewish historian Josephus, writing for Roman audiences, confirms the execution and mentions devoted followers who persisted. Even hostile sources acknowledge his existence. They argue about his significance, not whether he lived. The rapid spread of the movement itself requires historical explanation. Something remarkable happened to cause it. Ordinary fishermen and tax collectors transformed into missionaries willing to face persecution for their message. Within decades, communities of believers existed across the Roman Empire, from Jerusalem to Rome itself. This geographic explosion of faith happened too quickly to be explained by gradual legend development. Archaeological evidence confirms first-century Christian communities established across major Roman cities within 30 years of the crucifixion events. The Roman historian Tacitus documented Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians in Rome, providing independent confirmation of their early presence. Pliny the Younger's letters to Emperor Trajan describe Christian worship practices and rapid movement growth in Asia Minor provinces. Jewish historian Josephus recorded the execution of James, the brother of Jesus called Christ, confirming family relationships mentioned in Christian sources. Multiple independent sources from different perspectives, Romans, Jews, and Christians, all reference Jesus within decades of his lifetime. The convergence of hostile, neutral, and sympathetic accounts creates exceptionally strong historical verification, impossible to dismiss as coordinated fabrication. Even critics and opponents documented Jesus' existence while disputing his identity, inadvertently confirming the basic historical facts they opposed. The Talmud references Jesus in hostile terms, acknowledging his existence and influence while attacking his teachings from an opposing religious perspective. This pattern, where enemies confirm facts while disputing meaning, represents the strongest possible form of independent historical verification available to scholars. No serious historian questions Jesus' historical existence. The evidence from multiple independent sources across hostile boundaries makes denial academically untenable. Beyond written records, archaeological discoveries continue revealing the world Jesus inhabited with stunning precision and detail. In 1961, Italian archaeologists discovered a limestone block in Caesarea Maritima that would change historical debate forever. The Pilate stone bears a Latin inscription mentioning Pontius Pilate as prefect of Judea, confirming gospel accounts with physical evidence. This single stone fragment demolishes any argument that Pilate was merely a fictional character invented by gospel writers. The James ossuary, a 1st century bone box, bears an Aramaic inscription identifying its contents as James, brother of Jesus. While the ossuary's authenticity sparked debate, the inscription itself matches 1st century Jewish burial customs and naming patterns perfectly. Archaeological evidence from Nazareth, Capernaum, and Jerusalem reveals the exact physical world described in gospel narratives with remarkable precision. 1st century fishing boats recovered from the Sea of Galilee match gospel descriptions exactly, down to construction methods and capacity. These archaeological discoveries don't merely corroborate gospel accounts, they demonstrate the writers possessed accurate knowledge of 1st century Palestine. The convergence of written testimony and archaeological proof creates an unassailable historical foundation, impossible to dismiss through skepticism alone. Beyond written testimony and archaeology, we find the most compelling evidence in the transformation of witnesses themselves. Ordinary men and women who encountered Jesus underwent radical personality changes that historical skeptics cannot explain. Peter, a simple fisherman, became bold enough to face execution rather than deny what he witnessed. Paul, a violent persecutor of Christians, became Christianity's greatest advocate, ultimately accepting martyrdom for his testimony. These transformations occurred suddenly, completely, and permanently. Psychological changes that demand a historical explanation beyond mere enthusiasm. 11 of Jesus' 12 disciples died as martyrs, refusing to recant testimonies they knew were either true or false. People will die for beliefs they mistakenly think are true, but they will not die for lies they know they invented. The disciples had every opportunity to escape persecution, yet they consistently chose their testimony over survival for decades. James, Jesus' own brother, and once a skeptic, died declaring his brother's resurrection. Family members know the truth. This pattern of transformation and martyrdom spans eyewitnesses, skeptics, and enemies, a convergence impossible to explain without a genuine encounter. The 7th piece of evidence stands as perhaps the most remarkable, the explosive growth of a movement that defied every historical expectation. Within 3 decades of Jesus' death, this movement had spread across the entire Roman Empire, converting thousands despite systematic persecution. No other religious movement in history achieved such rapid expansion, especially one centered on a crucified criminal from an obscure province. Early converts abandoned everything: family ties, social status, economic security, embracing a message that offered nothing but hardship in this life. They joined a community that the Roman Empire actively suppressed, where membership could mean imprisonment, torture, or execution. Yet they came by thousands, then tens of thousands, drawn by the testimonies of those who claimed to have encountered the risen Jesus. The movement's explosive growth is itself historical evidence. Something profound must have happened to launch such an unprecedented phenomenon. No conspiracy could survive such scrutiny. No hallucination could convince thousands. No legend could spread so rapidly among living eyewitnesses. The early church's explosive growth under persecution remains one of history's most documented and least explicable phenomena, unless the resurrection actually occurred. 7 independent lines of evidence, each substantial, together overwhelming, converge on a conclusion that ancient critics and modern skeptics have never adequately explained away. The evidence doesn't require faith to accept, only the honesty to examine it and the courage to follow where it leads. 7 pillars of proof stand unshaken: non-Christian sources, archaeological discoveries, manuscript evidence, martyrdom accounts, early church growth, enemy attestation, and unwavering testimony. Each strand of evidence independently confirms the historical Jesus. Together, they form an unbreakable cord that spans 2,000 years. The question is no longer whether Jesus existed, but what we will do with the overwhelming evidence that he did. History has rendered its verdict. The tomb was empty. The witnesses were real. The transformation was documented. The evidence demands a response. From Tacitus to Josephus, from archaeology to martyrdom, from manuscripts to explosive church growth, every path leads to the same conclusion. The skeptic must explain away not one piece of evidence, but 7 independent categories, each substantial, together insurmountable. This isn't about convincing believers, they already know. This is about presenting skeptics with evidence they cannot honestly dismiss. The historical Jesus is not a matter of faith, though faith follows. He is a matter of documented fact that demands acknowledgement. 2,000 years have passed. The evidence remains. The tomb stays empty. The testimony stands unshaken. History has spoken. Will you listen? 7 pieces of evidence, 7 doorways into history, 7 reasons why skepticism meets its match in documentation. Flavius Josephus, born just years after the crucifixion, wrote not once but twice about Jesus in official Roman histories. Tacitus, Rome's greatest historian, recorded the execution under Pontius Pilate as established fact, not religious myth. Pliny the Younger wrote to Emperor Trajan, describing Christians worshipping Christ, confirming both the man and the movement. The Talmud, written by those who opposed Christianity, still acknowledged Jesus existed and was executed by Jewish authorities. 4 gospel accounts written within decades of events, closer to the source than most ancient histories we accept. Paul's letters predate the Gospels, written just 15 to 30 years after the crucifixion by someone who knew the witnesses. Archaeology confirms the places, the practices, the people. From Nazareth to Pilate's inscription, the details check out. The empty tomb, the transformed disciples, the explosion of Christianity, effects that demand an adequate cause beyond legend. This is not blind faith. This is documented history meeting honest investigation. This is evidence that refuses to disappear. 7 pieces of evidence, 7 historical anchors, each one independently verified, collectively overwhelming. Non-Christian sources, Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny, confirm his existence through hostile witnesses. The Gospels, written within living memory, provide eyewitness accounts that withstand literary and historical scrutiny. Archaeological discoveries, Pilate's inscription, Nazareth excavations, crucifixion evidence, corroborate the Gospel narratives. The rapid spread of Christianity, despite relentless persecution, demands an explanation far beyond the reach of myth or legend. The transformation of the disciples, from terrified deserters to fearless proclaimers, demands a catalytic event. The empty tomb, acknowledged even by its critics, stands as a historical fact, requiring a verdict. The testimony of women as the first witnesses, a detail no fabricator would ever dare to invent in that culture. These converging lines of evidence, literary, archaeological, and testimonial, all point toward the same historical conclusion. This is not a request to abandon reason. This is a call to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The Gospels preserve the raw, embarrassing details no mythmaker would include: Peter's denial, the disciples' cowardice, and women as the primary witnesses. Ancient writers fabricating legends sought to elevate their heroes. These texts do the opposite, preserving failures alongside faith. In that culture, a woman's testimony held no legal weight. Yet the Gospels unanimously report women discovering the empty tomb first. No fabricator would choose unreliable witnesses for the faith's cornerstone claim. This detail argues for authenticity, not invention. Early dating pushes these accounts close to the events. Too soon for legend to replace memory, too near for mass fabrication. Whether you believe in the resurrection or not, the historical Jesus, teacher, healer, crucified under Pilate, is established beyond reasonable doubt. The convergence of evidence, Roman records, Jewish sources, archaeology, and the earliest Christian texts creates an overwhelming historical consensus. No serious historian today denies that Jesus existed. The debate centers on interpretation, not on whether he walked the dusty roads of ancient Judea. From Tacitus to Josephus, from Pliny to the Talmud, from archaeology to manuscript evidence, history speaks with remarkable clarity. The evidence doesn't demand faith, it simply demands an honest engagement with what ancient sources actually tell us about a real man. Whether you believe he was divine or simply a remarkable teacher, the historical reality remains. Jesus of Nazareth walked these ancient streets. He taught in synagogues, healed in marketplaces, challenged the authorities, and ultimately faced execution under Roman law, all documented historical realities. The tomb is empty now, weathered by the passage of centuries. But the historical record it represents, of burial, claims, and consequences, remains remarkably full. These 7 pieces of evidence, each independently verified, each remarkably consistent, paint a clear portrait of a real historical figure named Jesus. From Pilate's inscription to Paul's letters, from Josephus's account to the Talmud's reluctant acknowledgement, the evidence converges from every direction. The question was never whether Jesus existed. The evidence settled that long ago. The questions that remain are of meaning, interpretation, and what we do with that historical reality. The historical Jesus emerges not from faith alone, but from documentary evidence spanning cultures and centuries. Roman military records, Jewish historical accounts, and early Christian writings all converge on one undeniable fact: he lived. Pontius Pilate's name inscribed in stone, confirming the Roman prefect who ordered the execution, documented across multiple sources. Josephus, the trusted Jewish historian working for Rome, wrote of Jesus and his brother James with clinical historical precision. The Talmud, compiled by those who rejected his message, still confirmed his existence and crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Tacitus, Rome's greatest historian, described Jesus' execution and the movement that followed with characteristic Roman precision and disdain. Pliny the Younger's official correspondence documented early Christian worship practices, confirming the movement's immediate historical impact. Paul's letters, written within years of the crucifixion, demonstrate immediate widespread belief in Jesus' historical death and resurrection. The archaeological evidence, from ossuaries to inscriptions, provides physical confirmation of the people, places, and events described in historical texts. 7 independent sources, from allies and enemies alike, all pointing to the same conclusion: Jesus of Nazareth walked in history. These 7 pieces converge into an undeniable historical reality, documented across cultures and perspectives. From Roman records to Jewish accounts, from friendly witnesses to hostile critics, the testimony remains consistent. No other figure from ancient history enjoys such diverse, early, and corroborated documentation of their existence. The evidence doesn't demand faith. It simply presents facts that scholars across all perspectives acknowledge. Whether Christian, Jewish, or secular, historians recognize these sources as genuine windows into first-century events. The historical Jesus is as well documented as any figure from the ancient world, perhaps better than most. 7 independent streams of evidence flowing from different sources, all converging on the same historical reality. The question is no longer whether Jesus existed, but rather what we make of the overwhelming evidence that he did.